Good morning, everyone. As President and CEO of the FICPA, I welcome you to our virtual town hall this morning, and I am very honored that we have the former Speaker of the State House of Representatives and now one of the leading voices in Washington in the recovery efforts, U.S. Senator Marco Rubio. And during our time today, I'm going to pose a few questions to the Senator regarding the Economic Recovery Act and the efforts. And afterward, our incoming chair, W.G. Spohr, will be asking the Senator a few specific questions regarding what the CPA community is dealing with today in relation to the relief efforts. Our members continue to be the boots on the ground. They serve our entities and our business clients, and we hope that the discussion today will help shed some light on their efforts. Senator, thank you for taking the time to meet with us today and talk to the CPA community. And especially, I want to voice a special thanks to you for your work on the Senate Bill 3612, which seeks to clarify the deductibility of ordinary business expenses related to the economic recovery assistance. That's a very big issue today. Our CPAs are needing clarification, and we are very appreciative of your leadership on this issue. So thank you again for joining us and for sharing your knowledge of what's taking place in Washington.
Well, thank you very much for this opportunity on what's an evolving situation. So I thought I'd break this out into sort of two realms. Obviously, we know, so to kind of oversimplify it, and I think it's redundant, but it's important to set the tone, I suppose, is what we're dealing with here is a virus that we know will kill X percentage of the people that it comes in contact with, even though we are learning more about it every single day. And as a result, countries around the world are struggling with trying to contain its growth. We're going to continue to face a threat from this virus until such time as one of three things happen. One, it naturally burns out, which we can't count on. That's not something that we can sort of count on. So the other two are the development of effective and widely available therapeutic treatments that change the nature of a disease, or ideally, the availability of a vaccine. On the therapeutic side, that would obviously potentially come before a vaccine, and there's some promising information out there. It's probably not a single treatment, but a combination of treatments that could be used together. But that too takes time to sort of establish protocols. Those protocols are being established on a daily basis, or being innovated on a daily basis by practitioners, which includes everything from plasma treatments to remdesivir to anticoagulants, a combination of things of this nature. But we're still learning about it, and it's going to take some time to get to that point. On the vaccine side, I think it's the safest thing to assume, and I'm not saying this is going to be the actual date, but I think we need to prepare. We need to think in terms of there isn't going to be a widely available vaccine until December of 2021. Let's just use that as a target date, not because I know that to be the target date, but because we need to prepare in those terms, sort of thinking in the worst case scenarios. And that, I think, gives you sort of the horizon of what we're looking at. If we treat this as some sort of situation that's going to clear itself up in 3 to 6 months, I think we're not being realistic. It doesn't have to be December of 2021, but that's how we should think in terms of preparing what we're going to do. The second question then becomes is how do you live in the interim? What is it that you do as a society in the interim, both economically and socially, to mitigate risk? And that's an important term. And when you say it to people, because there's always the tendency in this highly hyper-politicized environment to turn the term mitigation to, picking who gets to live and who gets to die. That's not at all what I mean. If it were up to me, I'd be in favor of whatever it takes to make the cases zero. The problem is that what it takes to make the cases zero is widespread vaccination and a vaccine that doesn't exist yet. And so we are in the mitigation business. It's as simple as that. We are, even if everyone in America hunkered down into their homes as we are now. You've seen how restrictive the things have been here in parts of the state of Florida, that we still continue to see people infected. It is impossible to have the rate at zero as long as this virus is out there and people are interacting with people, even on a limited basis. So what we try to do is we try to mitigate the risk. We try to slow the spread so it doesn't overwhelm our medical system. We try to mitigate we take additional steps to protect those who we know statistically are more vulnerable to catastrophic outcomes. And we try to put in place the systems necessary to monitor all that. How do you know what your hospital capacity is? You have to have an ongoing census of what are your hospital beds, what are your ventilator capacity, what is the daily traffic from your hospitals. You also have to be able to test, to both do real-time testing and ideally in a way that can be done quickly with rapid results, especially beginning with frontline workers and working back from there. But also the sort of testing that you would do for surveillance purposes, almost like taking a daily poll of a representative sample of your population. So you have a sense of what's happening out there and you can get ahead of an infection surge before that happens. Right now, we don't see a surge until people start showing up at the hospitals. So we want some sort of contact tracing available to help us sort of track where this is headed before it actually heads there. In the interim, we've got to figure out a way to open up our economy in the safest way possible. And when people say open up about the economy, it's not just about dollars and cents. It's about all sorts of things people haven't thought through when you close down an economy. It's about losing a year to a year and a half of educational value, because even though again, online learning can mitigate some of the losses in educational achievement, it cannot entirely replace the classroom experience, especially for students in the K through 12 system. It includes all of the parts of our economy that rely, and of our social lives that rely on things we've taken for granted because they've always been there and now they're not. And we begin to sort of, it involves things like the food supply chain, as we've already seen in mass production facilities, meat packing plants and the like, where suddenly we're seeing the potential for shortages, not because we don't have the food, but because we can't pack it and ship it. So that really is what government agencies are struggling with, and doing so in an environment in which the expectations continue to shift in terms of what the outcomes are possible for us. You know, this began as an effort to sort of save the hospitals and medical system from being overwhelmed. Has now turned into in the minds of some, being judged by a 0 or very, very low infection rate, which again is a very difficult thing to do with no active immunity available right now and no clear understanding of how long the immunity is. In the interim, we know that even under the best of circumstances, even under the most ideal reopening plan from an economic perspective, it will still not equate to what we had before the middle of March. And even if you opened up certain businesses and said, let everybody in, spend as much as you want, some industries and the way they function have been permanently disrupted. In essence, you know, again, I'm not a futurist, but it's a trend that I think will continue to evolve. You're going to see some big box retailers potentially not reopen stores in certain places. The sales just don't justify the footprint and the size that. So we've seen, you know, Nordstrom yesterday announced they're closing facilities in a couple of malls permanently. It was something they might have done anyways, but this has obviously accelerated it. I don't know how airlines, hotels, to a certain extent, restaurant and tourism gets back to the numbers they were, as long as this is an active threat, because even if the local officials reopen, you still have to have people able to travel and willing to travel. And by able doesn't just mean being able to find a flight and get there. It means having the economic wherewithal to actually spend money on vacation when they haven't been working for 6 or 8 weeks and are worried that a second wave is going to impact their bottom line and they're going to need cash reserves to deal with that. So I could go on for, you know, hours, I suppose, walking through all of these elements of it. The point is, I think we need to sort of accept that reopening in and of itself is not going to solve a lot of our problems. You can open a restaurant, but if people are afraid to go out or hold big gatherings because of the disease, your numbers are going to be down. And not being open, being partially open, is just as bad as not being open at all from both your overhead standpoint, the cost of your real estate, and your employment. So we're entering into, you know, uncharted territory where we're going to try to manage the best we can. So the job of government, starting at the federal level, is to try to mitigate some of the pain. Just like the disease, we don't have a cure for this economic disease. We do have some treatments that alleviate some of the symptoms and imperfect methods in which to deliver them. And so that was the goal of the first round of the CARES Act, was to try to address the acute severe conditions that we sort of saw. But even from the time we passed that bill to today, circumstances have changed, and it was impossible to sort of predict all of the different permeations this would take. So a pretty good example is restaurants who have figured out a way to sort of continue to serve people on a takeout model. It took them a few weeks to adjust to that model, but they've adjusted, but they've done so with a lot less employees, and their revenues have been impacted in a way that would change. I mean, if they knew they were going to be a takeout business, they would have a lot smaller footprint. They could be a food truck, I suppose, in many cases, if that's what they wanted to do. So that said, our goal was to, for example, provide a way to retain people on payroll and as long as possible through the Paycheck Protection Act. Some countries in Europe did that, and they did it by transferring the funds into the hands of the employers, guaranteeing, I believe, 90% of the wages on workers that weren't, even if they weren't working. People say, well, we should have done that. Well, we don't really have a mechanism to do that, number one. And number two, given the politics today, you can only imagine when news came out that we were transferring X amount of billions of dollars into the hands of some big company so they can pay their employees. We just don't have a mechanism to do that exists. And even if we did, the reaction to it would probably not make it politically sustainable. So the alternative was to try to figure out a way to leverage an existing imperfect infrastructure through the SBA, which was the 7A loan program, as the baseline that we would build on as a mechanism to deliver aid to those who qualified as a small business. Then a decision was made to, and I say this was a bipartisan decision, to sort of expand the universe of those who should qualify to not just be the traditional SBA standards, but also specific industries who were the first in and will probably be the last out, such as hospitality, and then the not-for-profit sector and so forth. So, it is a bit frustrating because you would think from reading the news reports that 90 or 70 or 50 or 30% of the money has gone to large companies. The average loan now is, in the second wave, as an example, is down to $72,000 or $73,000. It's actually a grant program for the overwhelming majority of its recipients. Less than a third of 1%, so 0.35% of the money in the entire PPP program went to publicly traded companies. And by the way, some of whom qualify for SBA assistance under existing standards, not because of the bill. They may never have used SBA, but they qualify. Being publicly traded does not mean you're not qualified as a small business, depending on what industry you're in, for purposes of existing standards. Nonetheless, this program, when it's all said and done, will have delivered close to $500 billion, $500 billion into the hands of over 4 million small businesses, and provided funds for 8 weeks of payroll for between 30 to 45 million Americans. So if you look at what the unemployment figures are today, add 20 to 30 million people to it, that's what we would be facing if this program did not exist. It has been, by far the most successful program in the CARES Act, and potentially the most successful emergency measure ever taken by the federal government. It was drafted in 4 days, rolled out in 6, and made, in just the first 11 days, made 14 years worth of SBA loans in 11 days, 14 years worth of transactions. And today, the biggest complaint that you hear is no longer, I didn't get my money or I've been denied. In fact, there's still about $120 billion there that's untapped. The applications have slowed. The two biggest complaints we're now hearing are, number one, uncertainty about the rules on forgiveness, that in essence, the Treasury is going to rewrite rules and people are going to find themselves with a loan. We're working on getting real clarity on that, and I'll address that briefly here before getting to your questions. And the other is the requirement that 75% of the money be spent on payroll in the first 8 weeks after you take the funds. On the first one of clarity, I've been talking to Secretary Mnuchin twice a day for the last 3 weeks. In fact, we spoke yesterday again at 10 a.m. and I have a call from him this morning that I need to return here soon about defining forgiveness in an easy to understand way. And my sense of it is that for over 95% of the loans, there's going to be a very simple standard for what qualifies for forgiveness. This was never designed as a program to recoup money, and we have no interest, at least from a legislative standpoint, in going out and collecting, $500 billion from struggling businesses who are trying to still recover from a pandemic, if they even made it. On the issue of the 75%, I mean, that's just I think their reason why they did that, it's not in the bill. That's a standard the Treasury wrote as an implementation measure. I think the design behind it was if they didn't make that requirement, then companies would be reticent to spend it on payroll and would figure out a way to sort of hoard it and use it for different purposes. And the goal here was to keep people off of the unemployment rolls and keep them attached to an employer. There is in the bill language, specific language, that provides the opportunity for an exemption to any requirement on payroll. And what it says is, if you are somehow unable to hire people back in the 8-week period, you can come back and say, but by June 30th, I had the same number of employees as I had before the pandemic. They may not be the same people because some of them didn't want to come back or whatever it may be, but found another job. But I have the same number of employees. The date is June 30th. Obviously, that may have to be amended because of the nature of this. That exists now. So that's the other thing we're pushing for real clarity is how is the exemption going to work so that those who are in an industry where they were unable in 8 weeks to spend it all on payroll, but 16 weeks later had the same number of people on payroll as beforehand, could still get the same forgiveness exemption. So those are the two things I'm focused on to get some clarity on from Treasury so that we can give people more confidence about how this is all going to work. I think moving forward, from my perspective, there are 3 areas that I think we should focus on. Obviously, the first is on the medical side, ensuring there's enough funds to develop not just a vaccine and antiviral treatments, but the ability to rapidly test. Imagine if we had a test that would give you, that could be self-administered at home or at the entrance of a school, and you would have results in 3 to 5 minutes or in a day. I think that would allow us to do a lot of things that right now are in doubt. So the development of that, making it affordable and widely available, is something that the government can help with. So on the medical side, those things are important. On the economic side, I think we're now dealing with the reality of, and we had the specific talk yesterday, do we want to jump and pass another bill right away? My concern is that we are chasing the ball where it is right now instead of where it's going to be. We got to try to figure out what these reopenings look like. What are the needs that the small business community is going to have, not today, but in 6 weeks, 8 weeks, and 12 weeks, and structure a program that's flexible enough to provide them the assistance they need, which I think is going to be a combination of continued payroll assistance to some level, operating costs to some level, compliance costs in terms of there may be costs associated with complying with local restrictions. You know, if you're told as a business you can open, but you have to put up those plastic barriers between the cashier and well, for CVS and Walgreens, that's one thing. For a small retailer somewhere else, that's another. So some of the costs associated with complying with local conditions are some, and people say, well, make it tax deductible. Well, that assumes you have the cash to do it to begin with. So, so these are the sorts of things we're thinking through moving forward in the months and weeks to come, and trying to craft something that's nimble enough to reach that and allow us to address it. So those are just general thoughts. I imagine you have more specific questions, and I look forward to answering them.
Yes, thank you, Senator, because you've touched on quite a few of the issues that we're hoping to see come to light. We're very pleased to hear that you're talking with Secretary Mnuchin, and the issue of forgiveness is key to helping our CPAs continue to work with our clients. There's so many questions, and that clarification you're talking about is desperately needed. And I know that you're talking with Secretary Mnuchin. Do you think that we might hear something this week, next week? Because our CPAs are trying to work through this with their clients.
Yeah, I do. I think there's possible we could hear something. I expect we'll hear something this week. If I were to guess, and this is just a educated, informed guess, is I think on the first item is the certification item, which has not been talked about enough, and that is that when you get this loan, you have to certify that economic uncertainty makes this loan necessary. And that's come about as a result of some high-profile cases of companies who took it. And, by the way, I want to be frank with you guys, because when we were talking about this, no one ever said we want to make sure certain companies don't get it. The whole focus here was keeping people paid. I don't think that a worker at Ruth Chris or Shake Shack, for that matter, is any less worthy of help than a worker somewhere else. Now, you can argue that those companies have more cash to pay these workers, but the truth of the matter is what we've seen happen is in many cases, firms have made the decision from a business standpoint that they're better off letting their employers go on the unemployment system. And that's what we were trying to prevent in the first place. That said, there's an effort to sort of address that. And that doesn't mean there haven't been abuses in the program, because there have been. And so that's where the certification language comes in. And so my hope is that we're going to have some standard, like, any loan under $350,000, which would capture about 94% of all of the transactions that have been made so far, are automatically deemed as certified. So now you've narrowed it down to just 6% of the transactions. And then of those 6%, give priority to loans over 2 million, which really narrows it down to like 2% of all the transactions. And then even there, we're going to have very specific rules, because let me tell you what happens if you don't write very specific rules. What happens then is that some inspector, auditor, regulator can decide whether or not if you don't have standards, the standards become whatever the person reviewing you is. Mm-hmm. I think we'll have at least a baseline announcement from Treasury as early as today or tomorrow that is going to take 90-something% of the loans off the table in terms of anybody being worried about it. I think the forgiveness piece is the next step, and I think it'll closely monitor and track most of that. And our hope there is, now that things have settled down, is that we can get some guidance as to what happens if you can't rehire everybody in 8 weeks, but you can rehire them in 12 or in 16 or in 18, because employers are facing different such situations. In some sectors, there's actually competition for those workers. They took a job at Walmart or Amazon, and now you can't get them to come back. So you're now having to interview and hire people in a very unique situation. In some cases, we've had reports that people are having trouble rehiring people because their unemployment benefits exceed what they would make at work. In other cases, the people that they need to rehire are specialized. You can't just hire anyone off the street. You have to train them to operate dry cleaning machinery or what have you. And right now, you just don't. It's not the ideal setting in which to conduct the job interview searches and so forth. So there's a lot of rationale and reason for why. In some cases, workers are saying, "I don't want to come back because I don't feel safe. I don't want to. I'm in a vulnerable population. I have a pre-existing underlying health condition." And so there's all sorts of things in the real world that make this complicated. So we're trying to have some flexibility, as long as and I hope that, I can't promise you will be in the next 48 hours, but know that the intent of the law, and that's what we keep pushing on, was not, what the intent of the law was twofold. Number one was to make sure that as much as possible this covered payroll, because this was not a business continuation loan, it was a payroll protection program. But number two, it was not to be in the business of collecting loans from people. I mean, this was not a money-making venture that we undertook. It was an emergency effort designed to provide assistance.
Thank you for that, because you've touched on several of the things that we keep dealing with, and I know that that it's a monumental task. It's coming at you from all directions, and the long-term effects of all of this will stay with us. It's not something that's, as you said, we will recover to the point where we were before this started. So at this point, I'd like to ask our incoming chair of the board, W.G. Spohr of Spohr, Bunch, and Franz, who's located in St. Petersburg, Florida, to share some of his firsthand insights in working through the practicality of these loans and the forgiveness, and asking some specific questions. So WG, I'm going to turn this over to you to talk about some of those issues.
Thank you, Deborah. Thanks, Senators. You've answered some of the questions, but I do have some specific ones. You mentioned, I think Justin mentioned, or Deborah mentioned earlier, as a supporter of Senator Cornyn's bill, can you share any insight into the taxability of the forgiveness in light of the IRS Notice 2020-32?
Yeah, so the law specifically deals with the taxability of forgiveness. I think that's not at issue, and the law, we actually dealt with that as having the loan forgiven is not taxable income. I think where the issue has emerged is the IRS is saying you cannot take the money you use in PPP and write it off as a business expense the way you traditionally would. And that again is problematic for our perspective. That was not addressed in the bill, but I can tell you that in writing the bill, the Joint Committee on Taxation built all of its revenue assumptions on the idea that it would not be taxable. So that is an IRS interpretation that needs to be clarified. And so my sense of it is that it's a technical fix that will find its way. The Cornyn bill will find its way into some legislation that we will pass either as part of a larger package or on its own through unanimous consent as a technical fix. Again, it's one of those things that caught everybody by surprise, and the IRS interpreted the way they did, and so now we've got to go back and sort of clarify what was meant by it, and we have a little bit of time in terms of when it becomes a taxable event for many, but nonetheless, it is something that we intend to address one way or the other.
Thank you. I don't know if you've seen this, but the AICPA has recently recommended that the 8-week forgiveness period either lines up with the beginning of a pay period, or for those businesses that are closed and are not able to open because of restrictions, the 8 weeks start when they're able to fully open. Have you seen this or given any thought to this or had any conversations with the Treasury Secretary regarding those specific recommendations?
Yeah, so the first part, the 8 weeks begins to run from the time of disbursement. So the issue really is, I think the first one is not as difficult to have some clarity on. The second one is more problematic because the purpose of the law, frankly, was to help businesses who were saying to us, we don't want to lay people off, but we have to because we have no money coming in. Obviously, conditions since then, in many cases, have changed, right? You've now been closed for 2 months. You never got the money in the interim, so you had to lay people off, and now we're asking you to go back and rehire them. And that's where the exemption for the rehiring comes into play. And that is the ability to go in and say, look, I was unable to rehire people because I didn't get this loan. I ran out of money the first round. By the time I got it in the second round, they'd already been laid off for 6 weeks. By the time I was allowed to even operate, I had to go out and find the people. Some of them didn't want to come back, so I had to find new people. But I really couldn't find. Why would I? If I only need 4 workers, if I have 4 workers, I only need 4 workers. I can only get 2 of them to come back, and I'm not even operating at full capacity. Why would I go out and hire 2 more workers that are perfect strangers not to work? One thing is to ask them to rehire someone who used to work for you, and keep them on payroll despite the fact they're not coming in every day. For a lot of people, that boat has sailed, and they've been out of work now too long for that to be a possibility. But another is to say, if the 2 people that used to work for you don't want to come back or can't come back, then go out and hire 2 perfect strangers off the street, and pay them not to come to work. That's not a realistic request. So that's why what was put in the law was the idea that at some date in the future, you can say, look, I wasn't able to spend the money on payroll in 8 weeks, but it's now 3 months later, and I have the same number of employees as I had before the crisis, and therefore I should qualify for forgiveness. So that language is already in the bill. What's not in the bill is the regulations as to how that's going to be interpreted, how you apply for the exemption, and so forth. So that's the part we're going to clarify. That's the part we're asking for guidance to clarify. And then the second part we're going to have to start considering is whether the June 30th date needs to be pushed back a little further, because the sort of the restrictions on operations vary from county to county in the state, and obviously from state to state.
Thank you. One of the questions I get all the time, and I'm sure a lot of the practitioners out there, is the definition of full-time equivalent, or FTE. There's been a lot of confusion, a lot of guessing on this, and as you know, some of the forgiveness has to do with number of FTEs prior to this, and then as a certain date, June 30th or whatever it may be. But we don't necessarily understand how to calculate that, even with the number of hours. People can guess, but we don't have specific guidance. I would ask if you can maybe shed some light on that. If we could get that sooner rather than later, that would help us tremendously.
Well, I thought there was, I don't have it in front of me right now, but I thought I had seen some definition of FTE in the Treasury guidance. If that doesn't go far enough for purposes of what you need, what I would ask is you draft the question for me. So for example, the way that, if you can draft the question for me in accounting language, with maybe even attached to it a couple of specific scenarios, hypotheticals. The way Treasury has been issuing guidance is they're literally posing it as a question and an answer, and they'll even cite a hypothetical in the example. So if you write us a question with an answer, a question and attach to it a couple hypotheticals, we might even be able to get Treasury to issue guidance specifically off the question that you've asked. So it would provide you some clarity there. And again, I imagine we're not the only ones that would be asking that. That would be probably a national issue that we're hearing everywhere.
Well, that kind of probably answers this next one, but this has to do with another problem we're seeing is the guidance says that an expense to be forgiven has to be both incurred and paid during the covered period. Some expenses, such as retirement plans, for example, while they're incurred during that covered period, might not be paid until 2021 because of rules that exist in retirement plans for matches or safe harbors or things like that. Is there any thought to the incurred versus paid as it relates to specific examples like retirement plans? Have you talked about that with the Treasury Secretary?
No, and I certainly retirement plans were considered as part of payroll and associated expenses to payroll. So it's certainly retirement is covered. I think the question you raise is valid. Really, we thought the bulk of it would be healthcare and salary, because we didn't want people uninsured in the process. Even people that get furloughed may not be getting payroll, but they're having their health insurance covered. So but I don't think we've gotten into the specifics of what you've outlined, which is the disbursements on the retirement contributions, which contractually might be biannual or annual. So if you would send that to me as well, we should be able to get some clarity on it.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Again, I tell you, the intent of the law is to cover it. So that just sounds like there's a quirk there. And it's a pretty easy fix in the guidance, which is, incurred and paid. Unless under the the system set up for that benefit payments are on a biannual basis. I think the reason why they wanted that incurred and paid is so that it was all available to you for purposes of the forgiveness part, and they didn't want people backloading a bunch of expenses and then later on not paying it.
Well, thank you so much for your time today and answering these questions.
Okay, thank you, Senator, because that does
Thank
shed
you.
some light on the specific questions that we have. And to your point, since our CPAs are boots on the ground and they're dealing with these issues every day, we appreciate the opportunity to pose some more questions, give you some hypotheticals, because that's what these CPAs do best, since they're in the thick of this every moment.
Right.
And on behalf of the FICPA and our members, I want to thank you for taking your time, your long-term support of the Florida businesses and the CPA profession. And again, call on us at any time if we could be a resource to you. We're here for you. And within this, we certainly want to wish you and your family and your team safe passage and good health as we make our way through this unprecedented time.
Yes, ma'am. Thank you so much for having me on. And again, please make sure I get those questions.
Yeah.
And you don't have to have hypotheticals, but they're helpful because they'll answer them and begin to get you some clarity on this as we move forward.
We will definitely take you up on that. Thank you.
Okay. Take care. Stay safe, everyone.
Thank you, Senator. Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
To everyone who joined us today, thank you. This concludes our town hall, and we hope that we can write up some recap of this, of what the senator told us, and hopefully we will look to the future of this week and next week to see what else may be coming out of Washington to help us on these issues, especially as they relate to the loan forgiveness. This concludes our day today, and we're dedicated to trying and bringing you more of these special and unique events as they're timely and hot topics. So to that, be well, stay healthy, and know that you're part of our FICPA family, and we appreciate you taking your time to be here with us today. Thank you.
Thank you.